Well, I'm excited to introduce our next panelists for what is one of our annual key events on the state of the North American carbon market. Let me first go to the folks participating virtually. I know they both wanted to be here, but they have incredibly busy schedules. Let me start out with Dr. Stephen Cliff, who is certainly serving as CARB's executive officer. He was appointed last summer of 2022, and as Chair Randolph indicated, he was involved early on at ARB with the development of the cap and trade program and other climate policies. He comes back to ARB after a stint as the 16th administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, where he oversaw the nation's vehicle safety agency that sets vehicle safety standards, identifies safety defects, manages recalls, and educates Americans to help them travel safely. His current job as executive officer, he works with the board that enacts programs to address not only climate, but air issues generally, and he oversees the work of approximately 1,800 employees with a budget of $2.7 billion. Welcome, Dr. Cliff. We also have the Director General of the Carbon Markets Bureau at Environment and Climate Change Canada, Judy Meltzer. Judy joined the department in 2009, and her past experience includes work in the nonprofit sector and the International Development Research Center. She holds a master's in international affairs and a PhD in political science. Welcome, Judy. And last but not least, to my left is Eduardo Piquero. He is the CEO of Mexico Zero Dos. Eduardo has more than 15 years of experience in international and national carbon pricing instruments. In his current job as the CEO of Mexico Zero Dos, he serves, Mexico Zero Dos is a Mexico Stock Exchange company where he oversees the development of environmental markets such as carbon and green bond markets. He has participated in the creation of a secondary market of clean energy certificates, which supports the Mexican wholesale electricity market. He was also instrumental in the development of a simulation exercise that was critical to the development of the Mexico emissions trading system, which they are now implementing on a compliance basis. He also serves as a member of the working group on green finance of the UN Initiative for Sustainable Stock Exchanges. Welcome, Eduardo.
Thank you very much.
I should also mention, for full disclosure, he is a member of the Climate Action Reserve's Board of Directors. So without further ado, I'd love to get into it with the panelists here. And our plan here is to have an exchange for maybe about 50 minutes or so and then open it up for questions. So please start thinking about any questions you may want to ask the panelists. Let's start out with more of a general question that I think everyone we face every day, which is there really are a diverse array of policies to address the climate crisis, which includes a variety of both compliance and voluntary actions. What are the major policy options your government is employing to respond to the crisis? To what extent are your government's policies relying on market-based solutions compared to other alternatives such as command and control? And how far do you think you have progressed, and what are the key challenges you face in implementing these solutions? Anyone interested in going first, or should I pick someone? Judy, I'm going to go to you, Judy.
Sure. I was about to jump in. Thanks very much for that. Can you hear me okay?
Very well. Yes.
Great. So really pleased to be here, and obviously a great question. So I'll speak to the Canadian context. So as we've outlined in our emissions reductions plan, which was published in March of 2022, so a year ago, we in Canada, we have a wide range of regulations, investments, incentives, programs at federal, provincial, territorial, municipal levels, so federal and subnational levels, to address climate change. So it's a wide mix of measures. It's certainly the case that market-based instruments are a critical part of this mix, including our clean fuels regulations that were finalized in July, and of course carbon pricing, which is a pillar of our reduction plan. And we've had carbon pricing in place across Canada since 2019. As was just recently highlighted by our Quebec colleague, in some provinces, it's been in place, of course, for much longer. We've had a carbon tax in British Columbia for well over a decade, as well as Quebec's cap and trade system, of course, linked with California. And so taking this into account, we've had to approach the implementation of carbon pricing in Canada in a way that enables subnational governments to implement their own carbon pricing systems, but also ensure that there's common consistency and comparability across systems. So our approach gives provinces and territories the opportunity to implement their own carbon pricing systems, but they need to be aligned with some common minimum national stringency requirements, which we call the federal benchmark. And then in jurisdictions that would prefer the federal government implement a system, or which choose not to implement pricing, the federal carbon pricing system, which includes a fuel charge and a performance-based trading system for industry, the output-based pricing system, we implemented in those jurisdictions. So we have, I think, an interesting landscape that enables different types of market-based instruments, so pricing instruments, across the country, but in a way that takes into account regional circumstances. And just to highlight maybe, and I'll wrap up quickly to allow colleagues to chime in, but we've really, I guess, to demonstrate the importance of this instrument in the Canadian context, we've recently strengthened the requirements that all carbon pricing systems have to meet in Canada. And that includes, for direct pricing systems, minimum national price of currently this year $65 a ton Canadian, going up to $170 in 2030, and requirements to ensure that our trading systems and credit markets are robust. So I'll pause there. We've also launched a national GHG offset credit system, again, part of the broader pricing landscape. But I think it's fair to say that while there is a wide range of measures, investments, and I won't go into specifics here, maybe we can get to it a bit later, market-based instruments play a critical role in the Canadian context.
Dr. Cliff?
Well, thank you very much, Craig. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and like my colleagues, hope I'm able to attend next year in person. I certainly miss the opportunities to network with all of you. We have had a number of things happening here in Northern California that have kept us at home, but we really look forward to continuing the engagement. And honestly, very much like how Judy addressed this question, from the very beginning, California has used a portfolio approach. If you go back to our first scoping plan,
We have technical difficulties. Dr. Cliff, you're frozen on this end. One has to love technology. While we're waiting for Dr. Cliff to come back, Eduardo, if I could turn to you to give us a synopsis of what's happening in Mexico.
Sure. Thank you very much, Craig, for the opportunity. I do have a slide to share with you if we're okay with technology. You guys know that Mexico presented updated NDCs last year, and it'd be great to have a look at it. I need to say that Mexico is facing some difficulties with ownership in terms of the climate change policy. A lot has been done in Mexico before the current administration, and also for full disclosure, I'm not part of government.
That's our intention.
I'm
sorry.
Sorry, I think we're already showing the slide. This is a very brief slide on the updated Mexican NDCs. Mexico has now an unconditional emission reduction targets for 2030 of 35% of emissions. That's a more than 15% increase in terms of what we had before. A lot has been done thanks to international support and pressure. Namely, the U.S. has played a very important role in terms of making Mexico become more and more ambitious. Also, additional targets have been adopted by the national administration, including 15% of penetration of electrical vehicles, 40 gigawatts of clean energy capacity, new generation in northern Mexico, and also maintain the industry target of reducing emissions by 2030 using our existing emissions trading scheme that has just finished, came to the end of its pilot phase in December last year. We are now over the first commitment period. Still, secondary regulation has not been published by the national administration. We do know that they are working on a first draft, still not disclosed to industry or the general public. We're expecting no major changes in terms of gases covered. It only covers CO2. We are not expecting the threshold to be lowered, and we are not expecting new sectors to be included into the next phase of the emissions trading scheme. So with that in mind, we might be talking of a perhaps 60, 70 companies covered and almost 60% of Mexico's GHG emissions. There is also a chart that Mexico's CO2 drafted on several commitments the country has made or not made according to Carbon Tracker. Mexico does have a very big problem, of course, in methane. The country has adopted pledges in COP26 on methane and forestry. In forestry, we do have a clear pathway towards zero deforestation, but not really the same on energy. And energy remains a challenge in Mexico. The country is still very much lying on non-renewable energy sources, oil and gas production, and we're missing the opportunity of clean energy generation. That will certainly be something for the forthcoming years to be revisited. But on the other side, let me tell you that 9 different Mexican states have adopted a price on carbon. And with them, 3 of them, including Querétaro, here we'll have a special session, they do have the possibility to cover that tax using certified emission reductions or emission reductions in general, coming from different international standards. So that's very good news, and that happened over the last 12 months. More and more subnational action it has taken place in Mexico, and we will continue to see more subnationals adopt carbon pricing as we're still waiting the national government to move forward on the emissions trading scheme. In that sense, we're still in. We're still in and still making lots of projects and looking to voluntary carbon markets. Mexico is called to be a large offset supplier and with at the same time local carbon pricing mechanisms already in place that will expand in the future.
Thank you, Eduardo. Dr. Cliff, are you back online? Apparently not. All right. I wanted to drill down on points that both, I think all 3 panelists have made, really related to the price of carbon. We're looking at, from what we know among the 3 different countries here and the price in California, that the price put on carbon is significantly variable, quite different from one jurisdiction to the next. Question I wanted to pose is that how important is it for governments to put a price on carbon, and what progress has your government made in establishing a carbon price? And Dr. Cliff, are you back with us now?
Hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you now.
Okay. For some reason, the Zoom's going in and out. Judy and I were having a nice chat on the side here, but
that never happens to anybody.
So I think I heard the question, how important is it to put carbon pricing on, for governments to put carbon pricing on? From a California perspective, it was starting in my last response to talk about our portfolio approach. And so maybe I'll just sort of extend the thought there that as part of an overall large-scale strategy for reducing emissions, we do believe that carbon pricing is a critical part of reducing emissions. And as you heard the chair say in her opening remarks, it's critical because it helps leverage innovation in the private sector, where carbon pricing ensures that we have a focus on the most energy and emissions efficient approach for any type of innovation that occurs in the future. Carbon pricing also has the benefit in California of taking money that we receive from the auctions and leveraging that by investing in ways that get emission reductions and those that are primarily focused on priority populations. In our case, we're getting emission reductions and the benefits are focused in communities that need help the most. More than 70% of the funds have been dedicated to those communities. So while carbon pricing can be done in a variety of forms, our cap and trade program oversees about 80% of the economy and helps to increase the reductions that we're getting from our direct emission reduction strategies, such as various regulations on the transportation sector and the energy sector and so forth. But it also helps us achieve those reductions in ways that can allow government to very much use the benefits of the program in ways that achieve an overall strategy where we're focusing the money from these programs in specific communities. In addition to the carbon pricing strategies, though, it is critical in our view to have this portfolio approach. And as you see, going back to the very first scoping plan, we have leveraged every possible opportunity to get reductions. And we really believe that we're in a world where no reduction can be left behind. To get to carbon neutrality by 2045, to get to more than 48% reduction in 2030, we can't leave any opportunity off the table. And that includes not only the carbon pricing strategies and the various direct reduction measures, but it will also include strategies to remove carbon from the atmosphere and from streams of emissions at industrial facilities. So we're looking at carbon capture and sequestration as well.
Thank you. Ms. Meltzer?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I guess as mentioned, absolutely. It's while we have, as set out in our emissions reductions plan, we have a wide array of measures, investments, different types of regulations, including some targeted or command and control regulations. We see a price on pollution and carbon pricing a critical part of the mix. As Steve noted, I mean, it's a critical way to drive and kind of incent efficient reductions across the economy, incent innovation, create demand for that, make sure there are low carbon options available for consumers and businesses, et cetera. And it works in conjunction. So it's that mix of sort of push and pull measures. And, as one example, it creates, it rewards and creates revenue streams for investments in important initiatives like carbon capture storage. At the same time, we've got things like, investment tax credits that also help incent that as kind of an incentive. So the mix of measures is important. Carbon pricing, though, is critical for us. And as mentioned, we're working really hard to improve it over time. And we released some strengthened requirements that all carbon pricing systems have to meet. And for the 2023 to 2030 period, this was announced in the fall. So I think we've got seen real progress on how different types of pricing systems can also work together in one jurisdiction. So we've made a lot of progress, I think, both in getting pricing in place across Canada, but also finding ways to enable different types of systems that strengthen over time.
You want to say anything else?
Sure.
I think carbon pricing is the cornerstone of climate policy. I think there are no emission reductions without a price on carbon. We must defend not only one price of carbon. I think that the Canadian example is one that we can also use in the rest of Latin America. More than one carbon pricing could coexist in one single economy. I do believe that in our Mexican experience, it would be very hard to achieve emission reductions without carbon pricing. It's the first signal a company needs to take a decision on investments or to buy emission reductions. So with that in mind, let me tell you that if there is something that made private companies support the Mexican cap and trade program, was the introduction of several carbon taxes at the subnational level. Now they're claiming to be more in favor of cap and trade systems, and also an additional point was the discussions around CBAM that could also trigger political action in terms of carbon pricing. But we need a carbon price that is liquid, that also supports and encourages transactions on emission reductions. We need carbon taxes that allow certified emission reductions or emission reductions verified for a third party to be generated by that jurisdiction. We have several examples in Latin America. We have the Colombian example with over 40 million emission reductions already generated. Chile now adopting also the same scheme, and of course subnationals in Mexico. So I do think that we will see more of these examples. We will have more than one carbon price in Mexico. Yes, we will. And not only at the national level with the cap and trade program, but also the subnational. They will coexist. They will learn to coexist. There is room for that. And a proof of that is that many carbon pricing initiatives survived more than one change of government. We have also the state of Zacatecas represented. They survived a change of political parties, and the new incoming administration, they supported the already existing carbon pricing mechanism. So I think, Craig, that we'll see more throughout Latin America, and it will be very fun during the next couple of years. We'll have lots of fun.
That's great. I think all of your responses indicate that there's a lot of very helpful, aggressive actions going on in your jurisdictions. The flip side of that, I think we're all also well aware, is that we're out of time to address the crisis and more needs to get done. I'm curious from each of your vantage points, what do you think are the more critical steps that need to be taken to foster more aggressive action on climate change? And to what extent do you think you need to also assistance from other parties to assist with the more cooperative efforts, whether it's across your country, across your state, working with other states or provinces? Just how important is that cooperative angle as opposed to everyone just taking independent actions? Dr. Cliff, may I start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, it's a great question. Certainly, California has worked well with other partners in establishing programs and leveraging expertise in other jurisdictions, as well as helping to export some of our expertise to other jurisdictions when appropriate. And we are certainly in favor of solutions at the national level, as well as innovation that's happening in other regions. One of the ways that we think about this is it's important for the public sector to be taking a leadership role in establishing targets, establishing the rigor that's necessary for programs to foster and thrive. But we also don't want to lose any of the innovation that might be happening in any place where it can. And so we're encouraged by the idea that there's a number of targets that have been established by various jurisdictions, even if they don't have regulatory mechanisms in place, as well as those jurisdictions that have taken the step to put regulatory mechanisms in place and do work to further achieving those targets. In California, the way that we have done this is really in both looking at a carbon pricing mechanism where we have a program that works very closely with that of Quebec, and we have joint auctions and equivalent rigor in our programs. But we also have worked with other states in other types of carbon reduction measures, including our light-duty vehicle regulations, the so-called Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Cars 2 programs, the Advanced Clean Trucks program, which is a zero-emission mandate on manufacturers. Each of those programs has coordination with other states where they've been able to take what California has put in place and adopt that in their own jurisdictions. So what's critical about the work is that everyone needs to be doing more. As you say, we're in a crisis moment. We know that the opportunities are available and that this is the time to be taking advantage of that. Everyone is doing that in the way that works best for their own political situation, for their own kind of unique considerations in their jurisdiction. What we're seeing at the federal level is a lot of investment in carbon reducing strategies. Those would include everything from incentives for lower carbon transportation to cleaner energy and carbon capture innovation as well. So there's a lot of different opportunities, a number of different ways to tackle the problem. The key thing here is we all need to be tackling the problem from every angle we can and as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you. Eduardo?
Sure. Of course, we need a lot more aggressive action. And the impacts of climate change in Mexico and Latin America are enormous. Of course, we've been having the last decade, perhaps the sargassum crisis, perhaps not directly related to climate change, but also set high in the environmental agenda, but a very important, huge problem of water scarcity in North Mexico and going back south into Mexico City and surroundings, and that sets the agenda for this administration and future ones. So there is a general lack of capacities, not only in government, but also in the private sector. That's something that we still need to address, and cooperation will be essential. South-North cooperation will be essential for that. Mexico is always looking up to what California is doing. Of course, California's climate policy, even adopting regulations that look like, so that's still something to think about. There is also a general, of course, room to improve technology transfers that would still need to address, and I would look into the international role that the North American Free Trade Agreement has played. If there is something that put pressure on the Mexican government, has been the trade agreement with the US and Canada in terms of climate change. So that played a very important role, and it still does, and will continue to be in the future. So I would explore additional regulation, try to also suggest more aggressive goals in terms of mitigation and adaptation for Mexico in particular. And on the subnational level also, Mexico does have a lot of subnational entities, states with a very industrialized economies and a lot of emissions. We need also to support them and help them create the capabilities to design carbon pricing instruments that live long in the future. That's also a key task for the forthcoming years. I do think that's what the playground looks like right now.
Thank you. Judy, do you want to offer anything, or?
I think I would just echo that. I mean, it takes the full mix, and for us, the sort of collaboration to enable consistency, ensuring that mechanisms, including carbon pricing, are pulling in the same direction, are consistent and comparable, but allowing flexibility. That is built on, really like long-standing, deep, cooperative, collaborative relations across governments at all levels, and certainly that's been the Canadian experience. Of course, the Quebec and California experience with respect to cap and trade is an excellent example of interjurisdictional cooperation. But I'd certainly say that the need to ensure as well, because in Canada, in the decentralized context that is, in environmental policy, it's important that we all have a good understanding also as to what incentives and outcomes, different instruments in the mix are driving towards, to ensure that we're kind of pulling in the same direction. So just to echo the critical role of efforts at all levels of government and collaboration. And again, I will get repetitive if I keep pointing to this, but I think the interesting laboratory of different pricing systems that we have in Canada, but aligned with some common minimum national stringency requirements, is an example of that type of cooperation.
Thank you. It's obvious that climate is affecting all of us, but one of the real challenges is, as we're trying to address this crisis, is how do we protect and support underserved communities, particularly like First Nations and other Indigenous communities. From your vantage point, what are the most important steps your jurisdiction is taking to engage with these communities? And at the end of the day, frankly, how do we ensure that environmental justice concerns are fairly addressed? Eduardo.
Yeah, if I may. Well, perhaps you might recall that the subject of local communities and carbon projects was taken into the public some months ago. Let me tell you, nevertheless, that from my point of view, standards such as the reserve and VERET, they do have the existing safeguards to make those voices heard and include them into the design of emission reduction projects. With that said, the national government in Mexico was thinking about a regulation to support local communities and in the design of carbon projects. It seems that might not see the light during this year, at least, and they are thinking about some other things, some other subjects. But nevertheless, it is a topic that needs to be addressed. They should be included in carbon projects, and since inception. They also are some of the communities that suffer the most impacts of climate change, and they are in the front line of many of the impacts of water scarcity or natural events. So I would think that these strategies should be twofold: not only support them in the design of projects, but also support them in the impacts that they are suffering. Carbon pricing or carbon projects, they will not come to replace any social policy. That's something perhaps different. Their role is to create additional resources to what is already there. So the approach, I think that from the safeguards we have today are correct and perhaps need to be better addressed by project developers in that sense.
Any other comments from the other speakers?
Craig, if I may, I guess the way I would address this question is first by acknowledging the serious issues that exist. And it's a really important question because we certainly are aware that not only historically, but even today, there are inequities built into our economic system, which has left many communities behind. And we're learning here in California, I'm certainly learning better ways to engage those communities. The way that California has approached this is by incorporating environmental justice from the very beginning. And while our approach has not been perfect, as I say, we're learning and hopefully improving with every opportunity to engage. We have an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which is an ongoing group that continues to learn and advise us about the best ways to address our programs. Critical to taking climate action is also understanding the clear benefits to our economy that can result from clean energy investment and reducing emissions overall, that we get not only reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but we're also reducing criteria and toxic pollution, and that we should address those benefits to communities that have been most burdened by those emissions historically and even today. So we see the overall climate strategy as an integrated approach where we're getting innovation, we're getting reductions, but we're focusing benefits where it's needed the most. And I mentioned in our carbon pricing strategy, the primary one, the cap and trade program, we get billions of dollars that we can leverage and use as investment in those communities, in addition to looking at approaches that get reductions and get benefits in communities, even from the program design itself. So that constant communication, learning, feedback, and addressing at every point environmental justice actually is going to create the most benefits for overall society.
Thank you.
If I can jump in, Craig, I would echo a lot of those comments. So for the Canadian context, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, of course, this is absolutely a priority, and Indigenous reconciliation in particular is a top priority for the Government of Canada as a whole in all of its actions, and not only, of course, in the context of climate or Indigenous communities, facing some of the greatest impacts of climate change already, but they are also leaders in help, in understanding both its effects and in tackling it. And so there are a wide range of actions that we're taking to, engage and consult and have Indigenous leadership in terms of all aspects of our climate plan. And this includes, very senior level distinctions-based tables that engage with, our First Nations, our Inuit, and our Métis national organizations, for example. Maybe just a couple of specific examples and concrete ones in the context of carbon pricing and our national offset system. So where the federal fuel charge, carbon pricing fuel charge applies, which will, based on changes coming this year, will be in the majority of jurisdictions in Canada. We have not only committed to returning all the proceeds from pricing back to the jurisdiction of origin, but in most of those jurisdictions, a dedicated portion, 1% of those proceeds will go back to Indigenous communities and organizations for climate action through programming that is co-developed with them. The bulk of it, 90% of those proceeds, in fact, go right back to households, which is a really critical piece of our carbon pricing approach to address questions around affordability, for example. And in the Canadian context, where the federal fuel charge applies and these climate action incentive payments go back to households, 8 out of 10 households get more back than the costs they incur from carbon pollution pricing. So it's a really key piece of the puzzle. And that disproportionately benefits, for example, low-income households. The other thing I just would note, because it's something that we're working hard on right now in my own team, is to enable Indigenous participation in the economic opportunities offered by our national GHG offset credit system. So this ranges from making sure that we've got Indigenous participants as we develop our offset project protocols, ensuring that we build capacities so that we have toolkits about how these systems work and how our own national systems work in multiple languages. So not just English and French, but also Indigenous languages, and also thinking about how we can design our system to facilitate Indigenous-led projects, and also take it into account when we think about risks around project permanence, for example. So we're really trying really hard to make sure that we're designing these types of instruments and systems with a view to environmental justice and reconciliation in the context of our Indigenous communities. Those are just a very small few examples. It's certainly a priority for Canada.
Well, thank you all for those very thoughtful responses. I wanted to broaden the question with a different angle. As we transition to a low, no carbon economy, there's inevitably going to be economic dislocations. What do you think are the best strategies for trying to deal with displaced workers that frankly, are going to find themselves possibly out of a job and looking for a new livelihood. As I mentioned, those dislocations are inevitable. How are you approaching that? What strategies do you think are most effective for addressing the inevitable shifts in our economies? And Dr. Cliff, if I could start with you.
Thank you. Well, I think the biggest economic dislocation is in the parts of the economy that we're actually trying to change. So that is largely the fossil fuel industry. And I think for us, we see the economic opportunity associated with climate action as actually enhancing our overall goals and enhancing the opportunities for new workforce. So while there certainly will be shifts, the overall benefits are still going to vastly accrue to those who are able to take advantage of a clean energy economy. In our scoping plan analysis, we see that getting to carbon neutral will actually create jobs and create economic opportunity. So it's certainly the case that the fossil fuel industry is going to have to see their work shift. And for those who continue to invest in parts of the economy that are to the detriment of our overall society, they're going to see the biggest economic dislocation. But in the case of clean energy and clean technology investments, there's going to be vast opportunities there. And we see this as an overall economic benefit to our economy.
Judy, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, sure, and maybe similarly. So certainly, each sector. So as Steve noted, I mean, when we think about economic impacts, we have to think about the economic impacts from climate change, and also the ability to effectively transition to a low carbon economy, and taking into account both the opportunities and some of the impacts, and how we can ensure that there's a sustainable transition in different regions. And in the Canadian context, certainly, the transition pathways for each economic sector, the different policy tools that we need to use, they all need to take into account kind of the realities of different regions. And there are different economic contexts and impacts that we need to think about through that regional lens in the Canadian context. And we've recently just released, as one example, a sustainable jobs plan. This was released by our Department of Natural Resources Canada, and it outlines specific actions that will need to be taken to ensure economic prosperity and sustainability for jobs across regions of the countries. We have coordinated kind of transition mechanisms, so regional energy and resource tables that are not only looking about how to enable the energy and technology transformations required across the country, but also working with federal, provincial, territorial partners to sort of look at how we can look at the economic opportunities and enable job creation and ensure a sustainable path, and again by region. I think the other the other thing I would note, just as part of this, this question, is the fact that, decarbonization in one sector will also often have positive spillover effects for, economics and job opportunities in other sectors. So as we look at transitions in the electricity sector, for example, that enables shifts in job opportunities in other parts of the economy, whether it's infrastructure or others. So it's a critical piece of the puzzle, and something that needs to be looked at, taking into account the realities of particular communities and regions. But it's also, as Steve said, it's about the opportunities that come with it. When we put out regulations, for example, like other regulators, we do very in-depth analysis of economic impacts, job and employment considerations and opportunities as just part of our regular cost benefit analysis of each regulation. So there's a lot of ways in which this is factored in. But if folks are interested, we have just released a sustainable jobs plan that's tackling that question.
Eduardo, you had mentioned the importance of NAFTA. I was just curious if you had any observations on this question from Mexico's perspective.
very much. But displacements in general in Mexico are a huge topic and very important, as you may know. Over 100,000 people waiting in the border, south of the border, to get into the U.S. just from Mexico and Central America, plus thousands also looking into entering not legally. I mean, 100,000 waiting legally to enter in the U.S. Rurality in Mexico looks different, of course, than the U.S. and the rest of Latin America. Out of 4 million homes in rural areas in Mexico, 90% of them are below the poverty line. So there is a very huge room for improvement in Mexico in general. That's why we demand a regional approach. The problem is not only in Mexico, it only comes from Central America and the whole migration phenomenon. That is why it's very important to expand our protocols south of Mexico, because we need to develop projects out there. We need to get out there and get the resources where they are specifically needed. NAFTA plays a very important role. Mexico also exports a lot of food, mostly tomatoes and fruits, to the U.S. You go to Target and you get a lot of Mexican products, even half of avocados are from Mexico. So that also plays a very important role in deforestation, for instance. The tequila also plays a very important role, not only in parties, but in deforestation. So that is why the importance of certification of products. We need to know not only what the CO2 amount of products are coming from Mexico, we need also to address that they are deforestation free. Mexico needs to take to start its work or to take over the work that's been done on certification of deforestation free products, and it's only a one solution problem. It's a comprehensive problem, of course, and carbon can play a very important role in supporting communities in certain areas, perhaps not all of them, in certain areas, perhaps south of Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, the mangroves, for instance, that they need to be taken care of. Communities do have a role to play, and resources could also benefit the local communities and try to discourage migration, a very important issue.
Thank you. I'd like to pose one more question to the panelists and then open up for questions. So please get your questions ready. And last question for me was going to come about the importance of the transportation sector. We have emissions growing in that sector. From your vantage point, what options are necessary to bring low carbon and no carbon solutions to market? And to what extent do you feel that you can do that within your jurisdiction, or that you fundamentally need cooperation from other governments? Judy, any thoughts on that?
Sure. Thanks, Craig. So, I mean, again, I would just say that you're right. I mean, this is a really critical sector in terms of thinking about where we need to decarbonize. And again, for us in the Canadian context, it is a mixture of measures, of regulations, investments, and incentives. So that ranges from, light duty and heavy duty vehicle regulations to clean fuel regulations to, reduce the carbon intensity of our gas and diesel, significant investments. So, massive investments for, rebates for ZEVs, for infrastructure investments, et cetera. So it's a mixture of measures. I think maybe to state the obvious, I think where, in sectors where supply chains are highly integrated, both within a country and between countries, and, the North American context is an important one when we think of transport, making sure that we're creating, consistent incentives and coordinated approach is critical. And I think my colleagues can probably speak to that as well. But I think, as I say, it's a mixture of measures across the transport sector, including pricing, clean fuels regulations, transport specific regulations, and a whole host of incentives, and a lot of cooperation with, for example, our US counterparts.
Anyone else?
Well, thanks, Craig. I appreciate the opportunity to address this. As my colleagues will note, transportation is the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions in California. It's about half of our overall emissions come from the transportation sector when you include both the emissions from vehicles themselves as well as the production of the fuel to support that industry or to support that sector. We need to address it as quickly as possible. And in California, we've had policies on the books for decades. Our first zero emission vehicle policy goes back to 1990. We had lower emission standards for vehicles now in place for about 20 years. We have a low carbon fuel standard, which is cleaning up the fuel sector for about a decade. Now, if you look at in-state use of diesel fuel, about 40% of that is met with renewable diesel. Almost all of the natural gas that is used in transportation in California is renewable natural gas. And we have regulations on the vehicles going to 100% zero emissions in the light duty transportation sector by 2035 and increasing targets for heavy duty vehicle emissions through both sales requirements for manufacturers as well as a new regulation that will require fleets to move towards zero emissions. And in certain sectors, completely zero emissions by 2035, especially in those areas that are serving the ports for goods movement here in California. So it's an area that needs to be critically addressed, and we're doing that in a very holistic way through all of these various strategies. And on top of all that, a pricing strategy under cap and trade. The fuels that are used in the transportation sector are covered by the cap and trade program. So we have carbon pricing very directly on the fuels used for transportation on top of all of these other opportunities to reduce emissions.
Do you want to add anything?
Sure. Yes. Transportation, remains a very important opportunity for Mexico. Transportation is the highest emitting sector in the country, but it's again a very important opportunity. In terms of public transportation, a lot to be done. Only Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Mexico City do have public transportation systems with metro lines. Several more have BRT lines, but still the room to build new infrastructure is still there. And the good news is Mexican subnationals and a lot of Mexican subnationals and the federal government, they do have very good rating grades. So they could come to the debt market and ask for resources and try to build the infrastructure that is needed. So that is one very big topic that we need to continue working on. A bit has been done during this administration, the previous one, but we need to put together a comprehensive transportation, low carbon program in Mexico urgently. That's very important. Number two is, as it's a growing and still very young society, people still buy new cars, and we're trying to of course, always look up to our neighbor and have houses with 3 or more cars. Fortunately, some subnational states do have some regulation on zero emission vehicles, but still not enough. We should work on a national policy on zero emissions for cars. A very big win was for Nuevo León a couple of weeks ago when Tesla announced a new gigafactory in Nuevo León, close to Monterrey. That's a national big win. That's something that made us very, very happy because we want Mexico to start making cars, electric cars, and only very few of them are produced in Mexico. And finally, if there is a sector of transportation that will be covered by the emissions trading scheme, is aviation. I would think that if there is someone to be covered by, additionally in the emissions trading scheme, is aviation. So we might see the Mexican airlines be covered by the national emissions trading scheme, perhaps during the next commitment period. So yes, it's not a one solution problem. We might need to include them in trying to avoid overlaps, but the incentive is out there, Craig.
Thank you. May I ask if the audience has any questions for our panelists? Andre?
Dr. Cliff, so the current targets for cap and trade are set at 40% reductions by 2030. With the scoping plan setting at 48, are you looking at those two aligning? Or is that still up for discussion during the process?
Thanks, Andre. Certainly, we would be going through a very robust public process to determine if and what targets are appropriate in order to align with the goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, as well as the new science-based objective of getting to a deeper reductions in the 2030 timeframe. So that's a conversation that we're really excited to have, and one that will be ongoing, in the next several months as we look towards amendments for all of our programs. And I won't just focus on cap and trade. Certainly, this is a conversation that we need to engage in with all of our programs to understand, is there more opportunity to reduce emissions in order to meet these science-based targets going forward? So this is a conversation that we'll be picking up in all of our programs.
I think we have time for one more question. Over here.
Thank you. My name is Reuven Carlisle, and up until 2 months ago, I was a state senator in Washington State, where I was the chair of the State Senate committee that passed the Cap and Invest legislation in Washington State. As you can imagine, we just finished our auctions in Washington State, our first round of auctions, so there's a lot of conversation around linkage. I'm very interested in the subnational leadership in Mexico relative to whether states are looking at cap and invest. We call it cap and invest versus cap and trade, but I'm just very curious whether there's subnational interest in terms of moving forward with the development of a program that would be potentially interested in linkage, of course, down the road with California and Quebec. And I'm interested in the perspective, of course, from California and Quebec regarding linkage with other subnational entities in Mexico and around the world, of course, along with Washington State, potentially.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, leakage in general was a topic in the introduction of carbon taxes at the subnational level. A lot of debates at the subnational and with their private companies. Of course, private companies differ in their sizes and what they do in terms of location. But let me tell you that we haven't found not even one case of carbon leakage, and I think that not even one has been documented globally. Of course, that hasn't been the case. But yes, it was a topic discussing with the private sector and trying to make the onboarding of those companies. At the same time, of course, I do believe there would be interest with linking with markets such as Washington or any other in the U.S. But again, yes, we do have a panel with subnationals at, I think it's 3 p.m., including Querétaro, a very important state that has designed perhaps the best carbon pricing initiative in Latin America.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists in the audience for an interesting discussion today. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.